Hey guys, tonight we're drifting into a very calm corner of history. The kind of story that moves slowly, like an old wooden ship creaking across warm water. So dim the lights a little, maybe lower the brightness on your screen, and settle in. There is no rush tonight. No battles exploding every 5 minutes. No dramatic betrayals every 10 seconds. Just a long, quiet wander through geography, ancient travelers, slightly confused mapmakers, and one very large body of water that ended up with the name Indian Ocean. Now you might think naming an ocean would be a simple process. Someone looks at a giant stretch of water and says, well, that's an ocean, and that would be the end of it. But of course, humans rarely keep things simple. We like arguing about names. We like drawing maps that contradict other maps. And sometimes we name places after lands that are not exactly in the center of that place. Because, why not complicate geography a little? So tonight we are going to float slowly through the long story of how the world decided that the huge ocean stretching between Africa, Asia, and Australia would eventually be called the Indian Ocean. And along the way we will meet ancient Greek geographers who were guessing more than they were measuring, Roman traders sailing toward spices, Arab navigators who actually knew what they were doing, and European explorers who arrived later and politely pretended they discovered everything. The water itself, of course, has been there far longer than any name humans could invent. This ocean formed hundreds of millions of years ago when the ancient supercontinent Gondwana began to split apart. India itself, at that time, was not even attached to Asia. It was drifting north like a slow geological cruise ship, very slowly. We are talking about centimeters per year, which is the least exciting road trip imaginable. Eventually, that drifting chunk of land slammed gently into Asia and created the Himalayas. Mountains rose, rivers formed, and south of this massive landmass sat an enormous stretch of water. Warm, deep, and connected to trade routes that would eventually shape half of human history. But in the earliest days of recorded civilization, people living around this ocean didn't think of it as one giant connected body of water. Ancient sailors usually thought in smaller pieces. To them it was a series of seas, gulfs, and coastal routes. You didn't sail across an ocean. You sailed from port to port, hugging the coastline like someone nervously walking along a wall in the dark. Early civilizations in places like Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley were already trading across parts of this ocean thousands of years ago. Ships carried beads, textiles, copper, and spices. These weren't massive fleets, just small wooden boats, carefully navigating winds and currents. But the trade was real, and it connected cultures that were surprisingly far apart. The people living along the western coast of India were particularly active in this trade network. Ports along the Indian subcontinent became busy hubs where merchants from Arabia, East Africa, and Southeast Asia exchanged goods. If you were looking for pepper, cinnamon, gemstones, or fine cotton fabrics, there was a good chance they passed through an Indian port at some point. And this is where the naming story begins to take shape. Because for many traders sailing these waters, India was the biggest and most famous land along the route. Not the only one, but certainly one of the most important. Now let's drift over to the ancient Greeks, who had a habit of naming large things after places they already recognized. Greek scholars loved maps. They loved writing about geography. And sometimes they loved confidently describing regions they had never personally visited. Which, to be fair, is a hobby humans still enjoy today. One of the earliest Greek writers to mention these waters was a historian named Herodotus. Herodotus lived in the 5th century BCE and is often called the father of history. He wrote long descriptions of the world as he understood it, including lands east of the Persian Empire. Herodotus didn't exactly map the Indian Ocean in a modern sense, but he did describe regions connected to India and the seas surrounding it. To the Greeks, India was already a mysterious and distant place. A land of elephants, strange plants, and very profitable trade goods. As Greek exploration slowly expanded, later geographers tried to create more organized maps. One of the most famous was Ptolemy. who lived in the 2nd century CE in Alexandria. Ptolemy attempted to chart the entire known world. His maps were impressive for the time, although they contained plenty of mistakes. Some continents were stretched oddly, some coastlines were optimistic guesses. But Ptolemy did something important. He described the large body of water south of Asia as part of what Greek writers often called the Indian Sea. In Greek texts, it appeared as Indikon Pelagos, which literally means Sea of India. Notice the logic here. The sea connected to India becomes the Indian Sea. Not extremely creative, but it worked. Now if you imagine ancient sailors approaching this region from the west, the first major land they often recognized was the Indian subcontinent. From their perspective, this huge stretch of water was basically the sea that led to India. So the name stuck in many geographical writings. At the same time, traders from Arabia were also navigating these waters regularly. Arab sailors had an incredible understanding of seasonal wind patterns known as monsoons. These winds changed direction throughout the year, allowing ships to travel east and west across the ocean with surprising efficiency. Arab navigators did not necessarily call the entire body of water the Indian Ocean. Instead, they used more regional names. But they absolutely dominated the trade routes for centuries. Ships moved between East Africa, Arabia, India, and Southeast Asia carrying goods like ivory, spices, gold, and silk. If you imagine the Indian Ocean as a giant marketplace, Arab traders were basically the delivery service that kept everything running. And India remained one of the central stops in that network. Ports along the western coast of India were busy almost year-round. Merchants speaking dozens of languages met there to exchange cargo and stories. Some historians even joke that ancient Indian ports were like international airports before airplanes existed. Except instead of duty-free perfume shops, you probably had sacks of pepper and someone arguing about the price of cinnamon. Now let's gently drift forward in time to the Roman Empire. Roman merchants were extremely interested in luxury goods from the East. Roman elites loved spices, fine fabrics, and exotic items that made dinner parties feel more impressive. Roman ships sailed down the Red Sea and into the Indian Ocean, using the same monsoon wind patterns that Arab sailors understood so well. In fact, a Greek sailor named Hippolus is traditionally credited with explaining the monsoon system to Mediterranean traders. Whether he actually discovered it or simply described what local sailors already knew is still debated. But Roman merchants quickly realized these winds could dramatically shorten travel times between Egypt and India, so trade increased. And with trade came more maps, more written descriptions, and more references to the waters leading toward India. Slowly, across centuries of travel and storytelling, the idea of a large Indian Sea became common in geographical language. But here is the funny part. No single meeting ever happened where people officially agreed on the name. There was no global committee of ancient cartographers sitting around a table saying, "All in favor of calling it the Indian Ocean, raise your hands." Instead, the name slowly formed through repetition. Greek writers used it. Later scholars copied those writings. Roman geographers repeated the term. Arab maps interacted with Greek knowledge. And eventually, European mapmakers inherited the same vocabulary. It was less like a formal decision and more like a rumor that became accepted fact. By the medieval period, many scholars across Europe were already familiar with the idea that the great ocean south of Asia was connected with India. The term Indian Ocean began appearing more frequently in Latin texts. And as we float quietly into later centuries, we will see how explorers, mapmakers, and empires continued spreading this name across the world's maps. Because humans love naming things, even when the thing being named is 70 million square kilometers of water. Which, if you think about it, is quite an ambitious labeling project. And the story is only beginning. And the story is only beginning. Because once the idea of an Indian Sea started floating around ancient geography, it slowly traveled across cultures, languages, and centuries like a quiet rumor drifting over water. No one hurried this process. History rarely does. Names grow slowly, especially when they belong to something as large and stubborn as an ocean. By the time the classical world was fading and the medieval world was waking up, the waters we now call the Indian Ocean had already become one of the busiest trade highways on Earth, not because empires forced it, but because nature made it convenient. Warm winds, predictable seasons, and thousands of miles of coastline created the perfect environment for slow, steady trade. The real heroes of this ocean were not kings or generals. They were sailors who quietly memorized wind patterns, merchants who spent months drifting between ports, and navigators who could read stars with the patience of someone solving a puzzle in the dark. For these people, the ocean was less of a mysterious abyss and more of a familiar road. Now, imagine you are a merchant living along the coast of Arabia around the year 700. You are not thinking about naming oceans. You are thinking about spices, profit, and whether your ship will survive the next storm. Your vessel is a wooden dhow, stitched together with rope and wooden pegs rather than metal nails. It creaks constantly, which is both alarming and somehow comforting. You leave the Arabian coast when the monsoon winds blow eastward. These winds push ships across the open water toward India. Months later, when the winds reverse, they carry you safely home again. This seasonal wind system was one of the great natural engines of history. It quietly powered trade across thousands of miles long before steam engines or diesel ships existed. Arab sailors understood this system extremely well. Their knowledge allowed them to connect ports from East Africa all the way to Southeast Asia. Cities, like Zanzibar and Muscat, became key stops along the trade routes. Ships loaded ivory, gold, and enslaved people along the African coast, then carried those goods across the ocean toward India. At the same time, Indian ports were bustling with activity. Cities along the western coast, particularly near Kerala and Gujarat, welcomed traders from half the known world. If you stood on one of those docks during the peak trading season, you might hear Arabic, Persian, Tamil, Malay, and several other languages all mixing together like waves hitting the same shore. Merchants exchanged pepper, cardamom, silk, cotton, porcelain, incense, and gemstones. Some cargo was practical, some was luxurious, and some was extremely expensive simply because rich people enjoy paying ridiculous prices for rare things. Spices were particularly valuable. A sack of black pepper could be worth an astonishing amount in distant markets. Europeans, especially, developed a borderline obsession with spices. Pepper was not just seasoning, it was a symbol of status. If your dinner guests saw pepper on the table, they knew you were wealthy. So ships kept sailing. And with every voyage, sailors shared stories about the waters they crossed. They described the coastlines, the winds, the currents, and the land surrounding the ocean. Gradually, knowledge spread between cultures. Greek geographical ideas mixed with Arab navigation techniques. Persian scholars wrote about trade routes connecting India to Africa. Indian astronomers developed mathematical tools that helped improve navigation. This ocean was not controlled by a single empire. It was shared by many civilizations, each contributing knowledge to the same network. And through all of this quiet cooperation, the association between the ocean and India remained strong. Partly because India sat near the center of these trade routes. If you sailed far enough east or west, you almost always passed by the Indian subcontinent. It was a giant landmark sticking out into the ocean like a massive stone pier. For many travelers, India felt like the heart of the entire system. Now let's gently drift toward one of the most interesting documents of ancient maritime history. Sometime around the 1st century CE, an anonymous Greek-speaking merchant wrote a guidebook for sailors. The text is known as the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. The title sounds dramatic, but the book itself is surprisingly practical. It describes ports, trade goods, and sailing directions across the Red Sea, Arabian Sea, and parts of the Indian Ocean. Think of it as a travel manual for ancient merchants who needed to know where to dock and what cargo might sell well. The author casually describes routes leading to India and beyond. To him, these waters were simply the highways of trade. But his writing also reinforced a geographical pattern that had been developing for centuries. The sea routes that mattered most often led toward India. And because ancient geographers loved organizing the world around familiar landmarks, many maps began labeling the surrounding waters accordingly. Now here is where things get mildly amusing in a sleepy historical way. Different cultures sometimes use different names for parts of the ocean. Arab sailors often referred to specific regions rather than one giant unified body of water. Persian scholars had their own terminology. Indian texts described nearby seas using local names. But when European scholars later gathered these various sources and attempted to create global maps, they tended to choose the term already circulating in classical Greek geography, which brought them back to the idea of the Indian Sea. And eventually the phrase evolved into Indian Ocean, not because every sailor agreed, not because the water somehow belonged exclusively to India, but because mapmakers enjoy consistency, and they were already copying older Greek geographical traditions, so the name slowly solidified. By the early medieval period, scholars across parts of Europe and the Middle East increasingly used variations of the term when describing the waters south of Asia. Still, the ocean itself remained a place dominated by merchants rather than empires. Large European naval powers had not yet entered the scene. The trade network was still controlled mostly by Arab, Persian, Indian, and Southeast Asian sailors, and they operated with remarkable efficiency. Imagine hundreds of ships crossing the ocean each year without modern compasses, without GPS, and without satellite weather forecasts. They relied on stars, winds, and accumulated experience passed down through generations. A navigator might memorize the position of certain stars rising above the horizon. He might watch the behavior of birds or the color of the water near coastlines. Every detail mattered. Navigation was part science, part tradition, and part intuition. Meanwhile, the ocean itself remained calm and patient, carrying ships back and forth between continents like a giant breathing rhythm. Trade winds pushed vessels eastward in one season. Months later, the winds reversed, and the ships returned west. The pattern repeated year after year, quietly, reliably. Over time, these repeated journeys helped spread not only goods, but also ideas, religions, and technologies. Buddhism traveled across parts of this oceanic network. So did Islam centuries later. Mathematical knowledge moved between cultures. Stories and myths drifted across languages. In a sense, the Indian Ocean was one of the earliest global communication systems. And yet, despite all this activity, the ocean still did not have a universally agreed name among the people actually sailing it. Names were mostly used by scholars writing maps, which means the final step in our naming story would arrive when European exploration began expanding across the globe. Because once European cartographers started producing printed maps for a growing audience, names suddenly mattered a lot more. A label placed on a map in Lisbon or Venice could eventually appear in atlases across the entire continent. And that is when the term Indian Ocean would finally become the dominant global name. But that moment arrives a little later. For now, our ships are still drifting quietly through the medieval trade world, guided by stars and monsoon winds, long before European empires decided they had opinions about everything. And soon, very soon, some curious Portuguese sailors are going to sail into this story, which, historically speaking, tends to make things complicated. Because up to this point, the waters of the Indian Ocean had been a shared space, a trading highway used by Arabs, Persians, Indians, Africans, and Southeast Asians. It was not owned by anyone in particular, and no single empire controlled the entire system. Merchants cooperated because it made business easier, and sailors followed the winds because the winds were in charge anyway. But somewhere in Western Europe, curiosity was slowly growing. By the late medieval period, European kingdoms had developed a powerful fascination with Asia. Part of this fascination came from stories written centuries earlier by travelers like Marco Polo. His descriptions of the wealth and complexity of Asian civilizations made European readers imagine lands overflowing with gold, spices, silk, and cities far larger than anything they had seen at home. Now, whether Marco Polo exaggerated certain details is still debated. He may have polished the story here and there. A little dramatic storytelling never hurt a travel memoir. But one thing was absolutely true. Asia contained goods Europeans desperately wanted. The problem was access. For centuries, many trade routes connecting Europe to Asia passed through the Middle East. Merchants from the Islamic world controlled large sections of these routes. That meant European buyers often had to purchase spices and luxury goods through multiple middlemen. Every step added cost. And European kings looked at those prices and thought, there must be a cheaper way. Naturally, the obvious solution was sailing. If a European ship could somehow reach India directly by sea, it could buy spices without paying extra fees to several layers of traders. That idea became extremely attractive to ambitious monarchs who liked profit almost as much as they liked glory. This is where the Kingdom of Portugal enters our calm little ocean story. Portugal was a small country on the edge of Europe, but it had something very useful: a long Atlantic coastline and a strong maritime culture. Portuguese sailors had been exploring the coast of Africa for decades. By the late 1400s, their ships slowly crept farther south year after year, mapping unknown waters. One of the key figures encouraging these explorations was Prince Henry the Navigator. Despite the famous nickname, Henry himself did not personally sail around discovering things. Instead, he funded voyages and supported the development of navigation techniques. Think of him as a sponsor of exploration rather than the explorer himself. Portuguese sailors gradually learned how to navigate deeper into the Atlantic. They improved ship designs and studied ocean currents. Their vessels, called caravels, were faster and more maneuverable than many earlier ships. By the late 15th century, the Portuguese had a bold plan. They would continue sailing south along the African coast until they reached the southern tip of the continent. If they could round that corner, they might find a sea route leading east toward India. Dias named the area the Cape of Storms, which was accurate but not particularly encouraging for future voyages. The Portuguese king later renamed it the Cape of Good Hope, because optimism sounds better on official maps. Dias had proven something extremely important. The Atlantic Ocean connected to the waters east of Africa, and those waters were part of the vast network already known to traders as the sea routes leading to India. In other words, European ships had finally found the doorway into the Indian Ocean world. A few years later, another Portuguese navigator would take the next step. In 1497, Vasco da Gama left Portugal with a small fleet and sailed around Africa. After months of travel and a few tense encounters along the way, his expedition reached the western coast of India. More specifically, he arrived near the trading city of Calicut on the southwestern coast of the Indian subcontinent. For the Portuguese crown, this was a monumental moment. A direct sea route between Europe and India had finally been established. Now here is where things become slightly ironic. When Vasco da Gama arrived, he was stepping into a trade network that had already been functioning smoothly for centuries. Arab, Indian, and African merchants were already doing business with each other quite efficiently. The Portuguese were essentially late to the party. But European historians later wrote about the event as if the entire ocean had been discovered that morning. which must have been surprising news to the thousands of sailors who had been using those waters for generations. Still, the arrival of Portuguese ships did change the balance of power. Unlike most earlier merchants, the Portuguese were not satisfied with simply participating in trade. They wanted control. Over the next several decades, Portuguese fleets established fortified bases along key points of the Indian Ocean trade network. Ports like Goa became major colonial centers. From these locations, Portuguese ships attempted to dominate spice routes using naval force. They introduced cannons on their ships and began attacking rival merchant vessels. Suddenly, the peaceful rhythm of seasonal trade was interrupted by European naval competition. This shift also influenced how Europeans mapped and described the region. Back in Europe, cartographers were producing increasingly detailed printed maps. These maps needed consistent labels so merchants and sailors could understand them. And because India had become the primary destination of Portuguese voyages, mapmakers began labeling the vast body of water surrounding it as the Indian Ocean. The term appeared in Latin as Oceanus Indicus. Once printed atlases began spreading across Europe, the name became widely recognized. Cartographers copied each other's work, and the label spread quickly. Within a few generations, the phrase Indian Ocean appeared on most European maps. From there, it slowly became the dominant international name. Interestingly, the naming logic was similar to how other oceans were labeled. The Atlantic Ocean was named after the mythological Atlas of Greek lore, while the Pacific Ocean received its name from the Latin word for peaceful, chosen by Ferdinand Magellan after encountering calm waters during his voyage. Compared to those names, Indian Ocean was almost refreshingly straightforward. It simply described the ocean connected to India. Of course, geographically speaking, the ocean touches many other regions too. It borders East Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Western Australia. It is the third largest ocean on Earth, but the name had already settled into global usage by the time modern geography developed. And once a label appears on enough maps, changing it becomes extremely difficult. Imagine trying to convince the entire planet to rename something as large as an ocean. Even historians would probably sigh and say, "Let's just leave it," so the name remained. But our story about this ocean is far from finished, because the waters themselves hold countless layers of history, ancient trade routes, migrating cultures, drifting continents, and quiet maritime traditions that lasted thousands of years. And as we continue floating through the story, we will discover that the Indian Ocean was not only a place of trade, it was also one of the great crossroads of human civilization, and occasionally a stage for some surprisingly strange historical episodes. Because once European ships pushed their way into the trading world of the Indian Ocean, the balance of power slowly began to shift. Not overnight, and certainly not without resistance. The ocean had been operating as a cooperative trading network for centuries, and suddenly a handful of ambitious European kingdoms arrived with cannons, forts, and a rather strong belief that they should probably run everything. Merchants sailed predictable seasonal routes. Families moved between ports. Languages mixed together. Religions traveled across the water. Ideas drifted slowly from one shore to another like messages carried by the tide. If you stood on the docks of a busy medieval port along the coast of Calicut or Malacca, you would see ships from Africa, Arabia, India, and Southeast Asia unloading goods side by side. Sailors might spend months waiting for the winds to change before beginning the return journey. During that time, they traded stories, learned local customs, and sometimes even settled permanently in foreign cities. Ports around the ocean became multicultural places long before the word globalization existed. Swahili language itself reflects this mixture. It contains words from Bantu languages, Arabic, and even Persian. If languages were recipes, Swahili would be the result of centuries of cultural exchange simmering slowly along the shoreline. And all of it was made possible by the ocean. Further east, another powerful maritime society flourished in the waters of Southeast Asia. The kingdom of Srivijaya controlled important shipping lanes near modern-day Indonesia between the 7th and 13th centuries. Its strategic location allowed it to monitor ships passing through narrow sea passages, connecting the Indian Ocean to the Pacific world. If a merchant vessel wanted to move goods between India and China, chances were it passed through territory influenced by Srivijaya. That meant taxes, port fees, and diplomatic negotiations. Trade empires like this didn't always rely on large armies. Their strength came from controlling key locations along shipping routes. If you controlled the straits, you controlled the traffic. And if you controlled the traffic, merchants had little choice but to cooperate. Meanwhile, India remained one of the central players in this oceanic network. Cities along the western coast of the subcontinent became magnets for traders. Goods from inland regions flowed down rivers toward the coast, where they were loaded onto ships heading toward Arabia, Africa, or Southeast Asia. Spices remained especially valuable. Pepper grown in southern India was prized across the ancient world. A small bag of peppercorns could travel thousands of miles and still sell for a high price in distant markets. Roman elites had loved pepper centuries earlier. Medieval European nobles loved it just as much. And merchants were happy to keep delivering it as long as someone kept paying. But spices were only part of the story. Indian cotton textiles became one of the most widely traded goods in the Indian Ocean world. These fabrics were lightweight, colorful, and durable. Traders carried them across the ocean to markets in Africa and Southeast Asia, where they were exchanged for gold, ivory, and other commodities. This trade network created a complex economic web. A piece of cotton cloth woven in India might travel to East Africa, where it was traded for ivory. That ivory could then be shipped to Arabia or Persia, where it might be sold again. Goods moved constantly. Sometimes it took years for a product to reach its final destination. All of this happened quietly, without a single global empire organizing the system. Instead, cooperation and mutual benefit kept things moving. Of course, that peaceful rhythm started to change once European powers realized just how profitable these trade routes were. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to push aggressively into the region after Vasco da Gama opened the sea route around Africa. Portuguese fleets began establishing fortified ports across the ocean in the early 1500s. One of their most important bases became the city of Goa on India's western coast. From there, Portuguese authorities attempted to regulate trade using a permit system. Merchant ships sailing through certain waters were expected to carry Portuguese licenses called cartas. If a vessel lacked this document, Portuguese patrol ships might seize it. This approach was not particularly popular among local merchants who had been trading freely for centuries. Imagine running a family shipping business for generations, and suddenly a foreign navy shows up demanding paperwork. Tensions were inevitable. Still, the Portuguese presence did not immediately destroy the existing trade system. Arab, Indian, and Southeast Asian merchants continued sailing the same routes. The ocean was simply too large and too busy for any single power to fully control. Over time, other European nations arrived as well. The Dutch established trading posts in parts of Indonesia. The British built commercial networks that eventually expanded into a massive colonial empire. By the 18th and 19th centuries, European influence across the Indian Ocean had grown enormously. And through all of this expansion, European maps continued spreading the name Indian Ocean around the world. The label became standard in geography books, navigation charts, and global atlases. Interestingly, the name was not chosen because India controlled the ocean politically. In fact, during the height of European colonial power, much of the surrounding region was under foreign rule. But the geographical association had already been established centuries earlier by Greek scholars and reinforced by centuries of trade centered around the Indian subcontinent. So the name stayed. Today, the Indian Ocean is recognized as the third largest ocean on Earth, covering about 70 million square kilometers. It stretches from the eastern coast of Africa to the shores of Australia, touching dozens of countries and supporting millions of people who rely on its waters for fishing, trade, and transportation. But the story of this ocean also includes natural wonders, drifting continents, powerful monsoon systems, and geological events that shape the entire region. Because long before humans sailed these waters, the planet itself was busy rearranging the map. And that quiet geological history is waiting just beneath the waves. Because long before merchants argued about pepper prices, and long before mapmakers wrote Indian Ocean on their charts, the planet itself was slowly shaping the enormous basin that would hold all this water, very slowly. The Earth is patient in a way humans rarely are. Hundreds of millions of years ago, the continents looked completely different. Instead of the familiar arrangement we see today, much of the land on Earth was gathered into a massive southern supercontinent called Gondwana. This giant landmass included what would eventually become Africa, Antarctica, Australia, South America, and the land that would later drift north to form modern India. At the time, of course, there were no sailors noticing this, no historians recording the moment. Just tectonic plates slowly moving, grinding, and separating beneath the surface of the Earth. Eventually, Gondwana began to break apart. Large sections of land started drifting away from each other across the planet's surface. One of those drifting pieces was the Indian Plate, which carried the future land of India northward through the ancient seas. This geological journey took tens of millions of years. If continents moved at the speed of human walking, history books would be much more dramatic. But instead they creep along at the pace of fingernails growing. Still, over enough time, those small movements reshaped the entire world. As the Indian Plate drifted north, it crossed an ancient ocean called the Tethys Ocean. This ocean existed long before the modern Indian Ocean took its present form. Marine life flourished there, and enormous layers of sediment slowly built up on the ocean floor. Then, about 50 million years ago, the drifting Indian Plate finally collided with the Asian continent. The result was one of the most impressive geological events in Earth's history. When those two massive pieces of crust met, the land had nowhere to go except upward. The collision slowly pushed rock layers higher and higher, eventually creating the towering mountains we now call the Himalayas. Even today, those mountains are still rising slightly each year as the plates continue pressing together. And while that dramatic collision was happening on land, the region south of Asia gradually formed a deep ocean basin that now holds the Indian Ocean. So in a sense, the ocean and the mountains are connected. The Himalayas rose because India crashed into Asia, and the ocean south of India became the watery space left behind by that long geological journey. Now, once the basin existed, it slowly filled with water from the global ocean system. Currents began circulating through the region. Over millions of years, marine ecosystems developed across coral reefs, deep trenches, and vast open waters. Long before humans built ships, whales were migrating through these waters. Coral reefs were quietly constructing underwater cities made of limestone. Entire ecosystems were forming and evolving without the slightest concern for human maps. Eventually, many millions of years later, humans did arrive along the coasts. Early communities living around the edges of the Indian Ocean relied heavily on fishing. Coastal villages appeared along the shores of East Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, and the Indian subcontinent. People harvested fish, gathered shellfish, and used simple boats to travel short distances along the coast. At first, most of these journeys stayed close to land. Open ocean travel is intimidating when your boat is made of wood and rope. Ancient sailors preferred seeing the coastline whenever possible. It provided navigation landmarks and, more importantly, the comforting knowledge that land was not terribly far away. But gradually, curiosity and necessity pushed sailors farther out. Trade encouraged exploration. A fisherman might discover that certain winds pushed his boat faster in one direction. Another sailor might notice stars rising in predictable patterns that could guide nighttime navigation. Little by little, knowledge accumulated. Across generations, communities around the ocean began building more advanced vessels. Outrigger canoes appeared in parts of Southeast Asia. Arab dhow ships developed their distinctive triangular sails, called lateen sails, which allowed them to catch the wind more efficiently. These innovations made longer voyages possible. One of the most remarkable seafaring cultures in the region emerged from the islands of Indonesia. Austronesian sailors from these islands became some of the most skilled navigators in the ancient world. They traveled enormous distances across the ocean using knowledge of winds, waves, and stars. In fact, Austronesian sailors were responsible for one of the most fascinating migration stories connected to the Indian Ocean. Around 1,500 years ago, seafarers from Southeast Asia sailed across thousands of kilometers of open ocean and settled on the large island of Madagascar off the coast of Africa. Yes, you heard that correctly. The people who first settled Madagascar were not originally from Africa. They were Austronesian sailors who crossed the Indian Ocean from Southeast Asia. Later migrations from Africa added additional cultural layers, creating the unique Malagasy culture we see today. It's a remarkable reminder of how connected this ocean has always been. Even in ancient times, people were capable of astonishing journeys when they understood the rhythms of wind and water. Meanwhile, monsoon winds continued shaping travel patterns across the entire ocean. These seasonal winds blow in one direction for several months, then reverse direction later in the year. Sailors learn to plan their voyages carefully around these predictable cycles. Leave at the wrong time and your ship might spend weeks struggling against powerful winds. Leave at the right time and the ocean practically carries you to your destination. This natural rhythm turned the Indian Ocean into a kind of giant breathing system. Ships flowed east during one season and west during another. Ports filled with foreign sailors waiting for the winds to change. Markets thrived during these seasonal arrivals. Entire economies began organizing themselves around this pattern. Even religious pilgrimages sometimes depended on monsoon timing. Travelers heading towards sacred cities had to coordinate their journeys with the ocean's seasonal moods. So the Indian Ocean became more than just water between continents. It became a living system that shaped trade, migration, and culture across half the world. And through all of this activity, the association between the ocean and India remained strong. India sat near the center of many of these maritime routes, acting as a major hub where goods, travelers, and ideas converged. So when European mapmakers later labeled the ocean Indian, they were unknowingly reflecting centuries of practical geography. The ocean had been connected to India in the minds of traders long before it appeared on printed maps. Of course, the ocean also holds deeper mysteries beneath its surface. underwater mountain chains, deep trenches, and geological structures that scientists are still studying today. Because even after thousands of years of exploration, the Indian Ocean still has secrets waiting quietly in the dark water below. And as we continue drifting through this long and sleepy story, we will soon explore how modern science finally began mapping the ocean floor and understanding its hidden landscape. And as we continue drifting through this long and sleepy story, we will soon explore how modern science finally began mapping the ocean floor and understanding its hidden landscape. Because for most of human history, people sailing across the Indian Ocean had absolutely no idea what lay beneath their ships. To them, the ocean floor might as well have been another planet. Sailors cared about winds, currents, and coastlines. What happened thousands of meters below the surface was mostly a mystery. Occasionally a fisherman might pull up strange creatures from deep water, or a storm might stir unusual debris to the surface, but the true shape of the ocean floor remained invisible. It wasn't until the 19th and 20th centuries that scientists began carefully studying what was hidden below those waves. And what they discovered was far more interesting than a simple flat seabed. The floor of the Indian Ocean is actually a dramatic landscape filled with underwater mountain chains, deep valleys, volcanic ridges, and enormous plate boundaries where the Earth's crust is slowly moving. One of the most important discoveries was the existence of a massive underwater mountain system called the Mid-Indian Ridge. This ridge is part of a global network of underwater mountains that stretch across the world's oceans like long scars across the Earth's crust. These ridges form where tectonic plates slowly pull apart from each other. As the plates separate, molten rock from deep within the planet rises upward and hardens into new ocean floor. It's a continuous process that has been happening for millions of years. In other words, the Indian Ocean is still slowly growing. Now imagine this enormous ridge running along the seabed, thousands of kilometers long. On the surface, ships pass over it without noticing anything unusual. The ocean above appears calm and ordinary. But far below, the Earth's crust is quietly reshaping itself. Sometimes volcanic activity along these ridges even creates new islands. One example is the island nation of Mauritius, which formed through volcanic activity in the Indian Ocean millions of years ago. Its lush landscapes and coral reefs sit on top of an ancient volcanic foundation hidden beneath the water. Nearby islands like Reunion were also formed by powerful volcanic eruptions rising from the ocean floor. Reunion is particularly interesting. It still contains an active volcano known as Piton de la Fournaise, one of the most active volcanoes on Earth. Occasionally, it erupts and sends glowing rivers of lava flowing down toward the sea. It's a reminder that the peaceful waters surrounding these islands hide powerful geological forces underneath. But the Indian Ocean doesn't only contain rising ridges and volcanoes. It also contains extremely deep trenches. One of the deepest points in the ocean is the Java Trench, located near Indonesia. This trench marks another boundary where tectonic plates meet, but instead of pulling apart, one plate slowly slides beneath another. This process is called subduction, and it creates deep ocean trenches where the seafloor plunges dramatically downward. At its deepest point, the Java Trench reaches more than 7,000 meters below the ocean surface. That's deeper than most mountains are tall. Down there, sunlight never reaches. The water pressure is enormous. Creatures living in those depths have evolved strange shapes and glowing features that seem almost alien. For centuries, humans had no way of exploring such depths. But modern technology changed that. In the 20th century, scientists developed sonar systems that allowed ships to measure the depth of the ocean floor by sending sound waves downward and timing how long they took to bounce back. Suddenly, the mysterious seabed could be mapped. Expeditions began charting underwater mountains, valleys, and plate boundaries across the Indian Ocean. Scientists realized that the seafloor was not static at all. It was dynamic, constantly forming and reshaping itself through tectonic activity. These discoveries also helped confirm the theory of plate tectonics. which explains how the Earth's outer shell is divided into moving plates that interact with each other. The Indian Ocean sits at the meeting point of several major tectonic plates, including the Indian Plate, the African Plate, and the Australian Plate. Their slow movement continues to shape the ocean basin even today. Of course, the ocean is not only a geological system, it is also one of the most important ecosystems on the planet. Warm tropical waters support enormous coral reefs filled with colorful marine life. Fish species migrate across thousands of kilometers following ocean currents. Giant whales travel through these waters during seasonal migrations. Some of the most beautiful coral ecosystems exist around island chains like the Maldives, where coral atolls form delicate rings around shallow lagoons. These atolls were originally built by tiny coral organisms slowly growing upward over ancient volcanic islands. Over millions of years, the volcanic islands sank while the coral reefs continued rising toward the sunlight, leaving circular reef structures behind. From above, these atolls look like turquoise jewels scattered across the ocean. Yet despite this beauty, the Indian Ocean also plays a powerful role in shaping global climate. One of the most important weather systems connected to the ocean is the monsoon cycle. Each year, seasonal temperature differences between land and sea cause massive shifts in wind patterns across South Asia and East Africa. These winds bring heavy rains that support agriculture for hundreds of millions of people. The monsoon is both a blessing and a challenge. When the rains arrive on time, crops flourish and rivers fill with water. But when the monsoon is weak or delayed, drought can threaten entire regions. So even today, the Indian Ocean continues influencing human life in profound ways. Its winds once guided ancient traders across the sea. Now those same winds shape weather patterns that affect modern cities and farms across several continents. And despite centuries of exploration, the ocean still holds mysteries. Large sections of the seabed remain only partially mapped. Marine species are still being discovered in its deeper waters. Scientists continue studying ocean currents and climate patterns connected to the region. In a way, the Indian Ocean remains exactly what it has always been. A vast living system connecting continents, shaping cultures, and quietly reminding humans that the planet is far older and far larger than any map we draw. And as we drift further into this story, we will soon explore how modern shipping, global trade, and international politics continue shaping the importance of this remarkable ocean. Because even in the modern world, the Indian Ocean is still one of the busiest crossroads on Earth. Because even in the modern world, the Indian Ocean is still one of the busiest crossroads on Earth. The ancient merchants, with wooden dhows, have mostly disappeared. The spice caravans are long gone, and no one is nervously staring at the stars to navigate anymore. Instead, massive steel cargo ships glide across the same waters, quietly carrying the modern world on their decks. The rhythm is different now, but the basic idea has not changed much. Goods move across the ocean, ports fill with ships, and somewhere along the coast, people are still waiting for cargo to arrive. In fact, if you look at a modern shipping map, you will notice something interesting. Many of today's busiest sea routes follow almost the exact same paths used by ancient traders centuries ago. The geography that made the ocean important in the past still makes it important today. Ships moving between Europe and Asia often pass through the narrow entrance, connecting the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean. This route became even more important after the construction of the Suez Canal in 1869. The canal cut directly through Egypt, allowing ships to travel between the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea without sailing all the way around Africa. Before the canal existed, a ship traveling from Europe to India had to make a very long journey around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa. That route worked, but it added thousands of extra kilometers. The Suez Canal changed everything. Suddenly, the Indian Ocean became the fastest maritime gateway between Europe and Asia. Cargo ships carrying oil, electronics, machinery, and countless other goods began passing through the region in enormous numbers. Today, a huge percentage of the world's trade travels across the Indian Ocean every single year. Oil tankers from the Middle East sail toward energy-hungry economies in Asia. Container ships move manufactured goods between Asia and Europe. Bulk carriers transport raw materials like coal and iron ore across vast distances. If global trade were a giant circulatory system, the Indian Ocean would be one of its most important arteries. Several narrow maritime passages play a particularly critical role in this system. One of the most famous is the Strait of Malacca, located between the Malay Peninsula and the Indonesian island of Sumatra. This narrow stretch of water connects the Indian Ocean to the Pacific trade routes of East Asia. Every year, thousands of ships pass through this strait. Oil tankers, container vessels, and cargo ships all squeeze through the same relatively narrow channel. At times, the traffic is so dense that ships must carefully coordinate their movements to avoid collisions. It's a little like a busy highway, except the vehicles are the size of small cities. Another critical passage is the Strait of Hormuz near the entrance to the Persian Gulf. This narrow waterway is one of the most important energy corridors in the world. Large quantities of oil exported from countries in the Middle East travel through the Strait of Hormuz before entering the wider Indian Ocean. Because of this, the region is closely monitored by multiple nations. Naval forces patrol the area to ensure that shipping routes remain open and safe. The importance of the Indian Ocean has also led to the development of major port cities along its shores. Cities like Mumbai, Dubai, and Singapore have become enormous economic hubs connected to global shipping networks. Modern container ports operate with astonishing efficiency. Giant cranes lift metal containers off ships and stack them into organized towers. Trucks and trains quickly carry the cargo inland toward factories and markets. A single container ship might carry tens of thousands of individual containers, filled with everything from clothing to electronics. Some of the largest ships in the world now sail regularly across the Indian Ocean. These vessels are longer than several football fields and weigh hundreds of thousands of tons. And yet, when seen from a satellite image, they appear as tiny moving dots crossing a vast blue surface, which is a humbling reminder of just how enormous the ocean really is. Of course, the Indian Ocean is not only important for trade. It also supports millions of people who rely on fishing for their livelihoods. Coastal communities across countries like India, Sri Lanka, Somalia, and Indonesia depend on the ocean's rich marine ecosystems. Fishermen leave their villages early in the morning, just as their ancestors did centuries ago, casting nets into the same waters that once carried spice ships and merchant vessels. Some of those fishing boats are still surprisingly traditional. Wooden boats with simple motors travel short distances offshore, returning later in the day with fresh catches. Larger commercial fleets operate farther from shore, using modern technology to locate fish schools across wider areas. Meanwhile, scientists are studying the ocean carefully, trying to understand how climate change may affect its ecosystems. Ocean temperatures are slowly rising in many regions. Coral reefs face stress from warming water and pollution. Weather patterns connected to the Indian Ocean can influence rainfall across several continents. Researchers are also studying something known as the Indian Ocean Dipole, a climate phenomenon involving changes in sea surface temperatures between the eastern and western parts of the ocean. When the dipole shifts strongly in one direction, it can influence rainfall patterns across Africa, Australia, and parts of Asia. In other words, what happens in the Indian Ocean does not stay in the Indian Ocean. It can shape weather and climate thousands of kilometers away. And yet, despite all our satellites, sensors, and research vessels, large parts of the ocean remain surprisingly mysterious. Deep-sea ecosystems are still being explored. Underwater geological structures continue revealing new surprises. Even the movement of certain ocean currents is still being studied in detail. The ocean remains vast enough to keep a few secrets. But one thing is certain. From ancient spice routes to modern shipping lanes, the Indian Ocean has always been more than just water between continents. It has been a bridge connecting civilizations, economies, and cultures across enormous distances. And the name itself, Indian Ocean, carries the memory of centuries when traders from across the world sailed toward the shores of India, guided by monsoon winds and the promise of opportunity. A simple name for a very complex piece of our planet. And as our quiet historical journey slowly comes to rest, the ocean itself continues its endless rhythm, waves rising and falling just as they have for millions of years. And the ocean itself continues its endless rhythm, waves rising and falling just as they have for millions of years. Long after the merchants of ancient ports disappeared, long after empires rose and fell, the waters of the Indian Ocean kept doing what oceans do best, moving slowly, shaping weather, guiding ships, and quietly connecting half the world. The word monsoon actually comes from the Arabic word mausim, meaning season. Sailors around the ocean realized that these winds did not blow randomly. They followed a schedule, almost like the ocean itself was breathing. During part of the year, winds blow from the southwest toward the Asian continent. These winds carry enormous amounts of moisture and bring heavy rains across regions like India, Bangladesh, and parts of Southeast Asia. Then, months later, the wind direction changes. Dry air flows from the land back toward the ocean. For ancient sailors, this predictable wind reversal was a gift. If you left the Arabian coast at the right time, the wind would carry your ship east toward India. Wait several months, and the winds would reverse, giving you a comfortable ride home again. This system turned the Indian Ocean into a giant natural highway. Arab traders understood this rhythm extremely well. They carefully timed their departures from ports such as Aden and Muscat, sailing eastward when the winds favored them. Meanwhile, Indian merchants planned their voyages just as carefully, waiting for the seasonal shift that would allow them to sail west toward the African coast. The result was a beautifully synchronized trade network. Ships would arrive in foreign ports and remain there for weeks or even months, while waiting for the winds to change again. During that time, sailors relaxed, repaired their ships, traded goods, and occasionally formed friendships or families in distant lands. Ports became cultural crossroads where stories traveled almost as frequently as cargo. Imagine a dockside market in the medieval city of Calicut. A merchant from Arabia might be negotiating for pepper, while a sailor from East Africa listens nearby. A Persian traveler shares news from the north, while a local trader explains the best time to sail toward Southeast Asia. Languages mix together. Food from different cultures appears on the same table. And somewhere in the background, a ship captain is checking the sky, wondering whether the winds will change soon. This slow rhythm of waiting and sailing shaped life around the Indian Ocean for centuries. Even religion traveled along these maritime paths. Buddhist monks once sailed across these waters carrying teachings from India toward Southeast Asia. Later, Muslim traders helped spread Islam along the coasts of East Africa and Indonesia. One of the most famous travelers connected to this ocean was Ibn Battuta, a Moroccan explorer who journeyed across much of the Islamic world during the 14th century. Ibn Battuta spent years traveling through regions surrounding the Indian Ocean. He visited cities along the East African coast, sailed toward India, and continued onward to Southeast Asia. His travel writings describe busy ports, diverse cultures, and the constant movement of ships across the water. Reading his accounts today, you get the sense that the Indian Ocean world felt surprisingly international, even in medieval times. Merchants from distant lands were not unusual sights in these ports. Foreign travelers were expected. Sometimes they were even welcomed enthusiastically, especially if they arrived carrying valuable goods. But the ocean also had a quieter influence. Beyond trade and exploration, it shaped the daily lives of ordinary people living along its shores. Fishing communities relied on coastal waters for food. Farmers depended on monsoon rains that originated over the ocean. Entire cultural traditions grew around seasonal weather patterns linked to the sea. In many villages along the coasts of Sri Lanka or Kerala, local festivals and agricultural calendars were closely tied to the arrival of the monsoon. When the rains finally appeared after long dry months, celebrations often followed. Because when your crops depend on seasonal rain, you develop a deep respect for the ocean winds that bring it. Over centuries, the ocean became part of cultural identity for millions of people. Songs were written about it. Folktales described mysterious voyages across it. Fishermen passed down navigation knowledge through generations of storytelling. Even today, small fishing boats still leave villages before sunrise across many parts of the Indian Ocean coastline. The technology may be slightly modernized, but the rhythm remains familiar. The fishermen watch the sky, they study the waves, and they trust experience passed down through families who have lived beside the ocean for generations. Meanwhile, out in the deeper waters, modern cargo ships continue crossing the same maritime corridors once used by ancient traders. A container vessel traveling from Singapore to Dubai may unknowingly follow a route that merchants used hundreds or even thousands of years ago. The scale has changed, of course. Ancient ships carried sacks of spices and bundles of cloth. Modern ships carry thousands of metal containers filled with electronics, vehicles, clothing, and machinery. But the ocean is still the bridge connecting those distant markets. And the name Indian Ocean continues appearing on maps, textbooks, navigation charts, and weather forecasts around the world. A name that started centuries ago with Greek geographers describing the Sea of India. A name reinforced by traders who sailed toward the Indian subcontinent again and again. A name spread across the globe by European cartographers printing their atlases. And eventually a name accepted internationally simply because it had been used for so long. It is a reminder that geographical names often grow slowly through history rather than being invented in a single moment. Sometimes the world chooses a name simply because generations of people keep repeating it. And so the Indian Ocean remains exactly that. A vast body of water carrying the memory of ancient trade routes, drifting continents, migrating cultures, and countless quiet journeys made under the guidance of seasonal winds. An ocean that helped shape civilizations without ever belonging to just one of them. And if you listen carefully, not to the noise of modern ships or the chatter of busy ports, but to the steady rhythm of waves against distant shores, you can almost imagine those early sailors still drifting across the water, following the monsoon winds toward another quiet horizon. And if you listen carefully, not to the noise of modern ships or the chatter of busy ports, but to the steady rhythm of waves against distant shores, you can almost imagine those early sailors still drifting across the water, following the monsoon winds toward another quiet horizon. The Indian Ocean has always carried that quiet feeling of movement. Not fast movement, not dramatic movement, just a steady flow of ships, people, and ideas moving between continents. And one of the most interesting things about this ocean is that, despite its name, it has never really belonged to a single civilization. Not India, not Arabia, not Europe, not anyone. For most of human history, the Indian Ocean behaved more like a shared neighborhood than a controlled territory. Sailors from different cultures passed through the same waters, docked at the same ports, and traded in the same markets. Of course, a few ambitious empires tried to dominate the ocean at different moments. The Portuguese attempted it in the 1500s. Later, the Dutch and the British tried something similar. But controlling an ocean is a little like trying to control the wind. You can influence parts of it for a while, but the water always belongs to everyone who sails it. Even during the height of European colonial power, the ocean remained crowded with ships from many different regions. Arab dhows still sailed along the coast of Oman. Indian merchant vessels traveled between ports of Gujarat and East Africa. Southeast Asian traders moved through island chains connecting the Indian Ocean to the Pacific. It was a busy place long before modern globalization became fashionable. By the 18th and 19th centuries, however, the industrial world began reshaping the ocean once again. Steam power arrived. Before steam engines, ships depended heavily on wind. That meant sailing routes followed seasonal weather patterns very closely. But steamships changed that relationship. A ship powered by coal could travel even when winds were weak or blowing in the wrong direction. Suddenly, shipping schedules became more predictable. Ports that could supply coal became extremely valuable. Naval bases appeared along key routes where steamships could refuel during long journeys. One of the most important of these refueling points was the island of Mauritius. Located strategically in the southwestern Indian Ocean, it became a useful stop for ships traveling between Europe and Asia. Further north, the port city of Aden at the entrance of the Red Sea also grew in importance. Steamships heading toward the Mediterranean often stopped there before continuing toward the Suez Canal. The canal itself transformed global trade patterns. When it opened in 1869, ships could travel directly between Europe and Asia without sailing around Africa. The distance between London and Mumbai suddenly shrank by thousands of kilometers. For merchants, this was fantastic news. For sailors, it meant faster journeys. And for the Indian Ocean, it meant even more traffic passing through its waters. During the same period, European colonial empires expanded across much of the ocean's coastline. Britain controlled large territories around the region, including India, parts of East Africa, and strategic island bases. The British Empire essentially built a network of ports and naval stations designed to protect trade routes across the ocean. But even then, the ocean refused to become a simple imperial lake. Local merchants still operated along coastal routes. Fishermen still worked the waters close to shore. Pilgrims still crossed the sea to visit sacred sites. The ocean remained too large and too interconnected to belong entirely to any one empire. And eventually, in the 20th century, colonial rule began fading across much of the region. New independent nations appeared along the shores of the Indian Ocean. Countries like India, Sri Lanka, Kenya, and Indonesia emerged as modern states with their own economies and shipping networks. The ocean continued connecting them just as it always had. Meanwhile, scientific exploration expanded our understanding of the ocean itself. Research vessels began studying deep water currents, marine ecosystems, and underwater geology. Satellites started monitoring ocean temperatures and weather systems. One major discovery involved the complex patterns of ocean circulation that influence global climate. Warm water moving through the Indian Ocean helps regulate weather across huge portions of the planet. Changes in these currents can influence rainfall patterns across Africa, South Asia, and even parts of Australia. In other words, this ocean quietly influences the lives of billions of people who may never see its shores. And of course, the ocean also has a powerful emotional presence in the cultures surrounding it. Poets have written about its endless horizons. Fishermen have built traditions around its seasonal moods. Travelers arriving at coastal cities often describe the same sensation, the feeling of standing beside something vast and ancient. Oceans tend to inspire that kind of reflection. You watch the waves rising and falling, and it becomes very clear that human history is only a small chapter in a much longer story. Ships come and go, empires appear and disappear, but the water keeps moving. And through all those centuries of change, the name Indian Ocean quietly remained. It survived the age of ancient trade. It survived colonial expansion. It survived the birth of modern nation-states. Not because the name perfectly describes the entire ocean, but because it reflects the long historical relationship between these waters and the land of India, which sat near the center of so many ancient trade routes. Geographical names are rarely perfect, but once they become familiar, they tend to stay. And so the Indian Ocean continues to appear on maps around the world, a simple label for a vast and complicated body of water that has shaped human history in quiet but powerful ways. And if our slow historical journey has taught us anything tonight, it is that sometimes the most important places on Earth are not the ones built by humans. Sometimes they are the wide open spaces between continents, the waters that carry ships, winds, and stories from one shore to another. And the Indian Ocean has been doing exactly that for millions of years. Waves rising, winds shifting, ships passing quietly across the surface while history slowly rearranges the world around it. The water itself does not care what humans call it, of course. But humans, being humans, tend to care quite a lot about names. And somehow the name Indian Ocean managed to stay firmly attached to this enormous body of water for centuries. Which is actually quite impressive when you think about it. Because many geographical names have changed repeatedly throughout history. Cities get renamed after revolutions. Countries adopt new identities. Rivers acquire different titles depending on which language you are speaking. But oceans tend to keep their names for a very long time. Part of the reason is simple practicality. Once a name appears on enough maps, textbooks, and navigation charts, replacing it becomes a monumental task. Imagine convincing every school, shipping company, weather service, and international organization to update the name of an entire ocean. Even bureaucrats would probably stare at the paperwork and quietly walk away. So the name stuck. But the story behind that name reveals something interesting about how humans understand geography. When ancient Greek writers first described the waters south of Asia, they often referred to them as the Sea of India. Later scholars writing in Latin used phrases like Oceanus Indicus. Over time, those descriptions gradually transformed into the modern phrase, Indian Ocean. It wasn't chosen during a dramatic historical moment. There was no official naming ceremony attended by philosophers and cartographers wearing very serious expressions. Instead, the name simply became common through repetition. Writers copied earlier texts. Mapmakers reused familiar labels. Travelers repeated the same terminology in their journals. And slowly the name spread. During the Age of Exploration in the 5th, 10th, and 16th centuries, European navigators traveling around Africa encountered the vast maritime world that had been active for centuries. When they returned home, they brought maps and descriptions that used the same traditional naming conventions. Soon printed at laces across Europe were labeling the region as the Indian Ocean. Once printing technology entered the picture, geographical names became even more stable. Printed maps circulated widely, and those labels reached classrooms, libraries, and navigation schools. Students learned the name. Sailors used the name. Governments adopted the name. And before long, it simply became the global standard. Interestingly, other oceans received their names through somewhat similar processes. The Atlantic Ocean was named after Atlas from Greek mythology. Ancient Greeks imagined Atlas as the giant holding up the sky at the western edge of the world, so the sea beyond that region became associated with him. The Pacific Ocean earned its name from the Latin word pacificus, meaning peaceful. The explorer Ferdinand Magellan gave it that title in the 16th century after encountering relatively calm waters during part of his voyage. Of course, the Pacific does not always behave peacefully. Anyone who has studied typhoons or massive ocean storms can confirm that Magellan may have been a little optimistic with his naming choice. Compared to those examples, the Indian Ocean's name is surprisingly straightforward. It reflects geography rather than mythology or personal impressions. The ocean lies south of the massive landmass of India, which historically served as one of the most important centers of trade in the region. So when ancient scholars tried to describe that enormous stretch of water, they simply connected it with the most prominent land nearby. Not extremely poetic, perhaps, but effective. And sometimes the simplest explanation becomes the one that lasts. Today, the Indian Ocean stretches across roughly 70 million square kilometers. It touches the shores of dozens of countries across Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Australia. Its waters support fisheries, shipping routes, tourism industries, and entire coastal economies. Modern satellite systems track its storms and currents. Research vessels study its ecosystems and geology. International shipping companies move vast quantities of cargo across its surface every day. Yet if you stand quietly on a beach somewhere along its coastline, the experience does not feel particularly modern. You still hear the same waves rolling toward the shore. You still see fishing boats leaving early in the morning. And if you watch the horizon long enough, you might notice cargo ships moving slowly across the distance, following invisible routes shaped by centuries of maritime tradition. Those ships are part of the latest chapter in a very old story. Because long before steel containers and diesel engines existed, ancient sailors were already navigating these waters using stars and seasonal winds. They did not call it the Indian Ocean in every language, but they knew the roots. They understood the rhythm of the monsoon, and they recognized that the ocean connected distant lands in ways that rivers and roads never could. In a way, the name Indian Ocean carries a memory of that long history. A reminder that for centuries, the Indian subcontinent sat near the center of one of the most remarkable maritime networks in the world. Spices, textiles, ideas, and religions all traveled across these waters. Cultures met. Languages blended. And the ocean quietly carried everything from one shore to another. Names come and go in human history, but some remain because they reflect patterns that lasted for centuries. And the Indian Ocean is one of those rare cases where a simple geographical name managed to capture a very long story. A story of winds, trade, exploration, and connection stretching across thousands of years. And while our quiet historical journey may be coming to a gentle close, the ocean itself continues exactly as it always has. Waves rolling forward, ships crossing the horizon. And somewhere out there, the same monsoon winds still guiding travelers across the water, just as they did for sailors long before anyone decided what to call the ocean beneath them. And somewhere out there, the same monsoon winds still guide travelers across the water, just as they did for sailors long before anyone decided what to call the ocean beneath them. The Indian Ocean has always had this quiet kind of power. Not loud, not dramatic, but constant. The kind of influence that shapes civilizations slowly, the way waves reshape a shoreline over many years. When we think about history, we often imagine kings, wars, revolutions, and dramatic speeches. But oceans influence history in a quieter way. They guide trade routes. They shape climate patterns. They decide where cities grow and where cultures meet. And the Indian Ocean has been doing that quietly for a very long time. Look at a map for a moment. The ocean sits between several of the most densely populated regions on Earth. To the north lies India and the rest of South Asia. To the west are the shores of East Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. To the east are Southeast Asian islands and the long coastline of Indonesia. For thousands of years, these regions have interacted with one another through the water between them. Not always peacefully, of course. Humans rarely manage that for long. But trade, migration, and cultural exchange have moved through these waters more consistently than conflict. One of the most interesting examples of this connection is the cultural world that developed along the East African coast. Cities like Mombasa, Kilwa, and Zanzibar became part of a vibrant maritime culture often called the Swahili Coast. These cities traded regularly with merchants from Arabia, Persia, and India. Stone houses appeared along the coast. Mosques were built using coral stone. Markets filled with goods arriving from distant lands. If you walked through one of these coastal cities around the year 1200, you might hear traders discussing prices in several languages at once. A ship from Arabia might unload dates and textiles while another vessel from India arrived carrying spices and cotton cloth. And the ocean was the road connecting them all. Further north along the coast of the Arabian Peninsula, ports such as Muscat and Aden also played important roles in this maritime network. Ships leaving these ports sailed regularly toward India, East Africa, and Southeast Asia. These routes were not random. They followed the seasonal monsoon winds that sailors had studied carefully for generations. When the winds shifted direction, entire fleets of ships would depart almost at the same time, heading toward distant ports. Imagine the sight. Dozens of sails appearing on the horizon, slowly moving out toward open water. A quiet migration of merchants and sailors following the invisible schedule written by the wind. The ocean became a giant seasonal highway. And with every voyage, cultural connections deepened. Foods traveled across the ocean. Certain spices common in Indian cooking today actually originated in Southeast Asia. Meanwhile, crops like bananas and coconuts moved between regions through maritime trade networks. Languages borrowed words from one another. Religious ideas traveled alongside merchants. Islam spread along many Indian Ocean trading routes through the influence of Muslim merchants and scholars. Coastal communities across East Africa and Southeast Asia gradually adopted the religion while maintaining local traditions. This peaceful spread of ideas through trade is one of the more fascinating aspects of Indian Ocean history. There were no massive invading armies involved. Just merchants carrying goods, telling stories, and slowly influencing the cultures around them. Even architecture shows evidence of these connections. In some East African coastal towns, you can still find building styles that combine African, Arab, and Persian influences. Carved wooden doors, decorative stonework, and interior courtyards reflect centuries of cultural blending. The ocean made these exchanges possible. Meanwhile, inland civilizations were often more isolated. Mountains, deserts, and forests can block travel in ways oceans sometimes do not. Ships, surprisingly, can connect distant lands more easily than overland routes. A single sailing vessel could move hundreds of tons of cargo across the water with relatively little effort once the winds were favorable. That efficiency made maritime trade extremely attractive, and the Indian Ocean was perfectly positioned to serve as one of the world's great maritime corridors. Even today, modern shipping companies rely on many of the same geographic advantages that ancient sailors discovered centuries ago. Cargo vessels still follow routes passing through narrow passages such as the Strait of Malacca or the Strait of Hormuz. Oil tankers travel from the Persian Gulf across the ocean toward Asia. Container ships carry manufactured goods from Asian factories toward markets in Europe and Africa. The technology has changed dramatically, but the geography remains exactly the same. The ocean still connects those regions, and so the name continues appearing on maps and shipping charts around the world. Indian Ocean, two simple words describing one of the most historically important bodies of water on the planet. A name that reflects centuries when India stood at the center of maritime trade networks that linked half the known world. But beyond the name itself, the ocean reminds us of something deeper about human history. Civilizations are rarely isolated. Even in ancient times, cultures influenced one another through trade, travel, and curiosity. People crossed oceans in search of opportunity, knowledge, or sometimes simply adventure. And the Indian Ocean offered them a pathway. A vast, patient pathway that never demanded attention, but quietly shaped the story of several continents. If you think about it long enough, you begin to realize that the most important highways in history were not roads or railways. They were oceans. And the Indian Ocean has been one of the busiest highways humanity has ever known. Still calm, still moving, still connecting distant shores under the same wide sky. Still calm, still moving, still connecting distant shores under the same wide sky. The Indian Ocean may look peaceful from a distance, but the modern world has turned it into one of the busiest places on Earth. Not noisy in the way a city street is noisy, but busy in a quiet, constant rhythm. Ships passing, satellites watching, nations paying very close attention to what happens on these waters. Because if you look carefully at the map again, you notice something interesting. The Indian Ocean sits right between several of the world's most important economic regions. To the east are the giant manufacturing hubs of Asia. To the west are the oil-rich regions of the Middle East and the growing economies of Africa. To the north lies South Asia with its enormous population and expanding trade. And right in the middle is the ocean, which means that an enormous amount of the world's trade travels across these waters every single day. Modern cargo ships are not the romantic wooden sailing vessels people imagine when they think of historical trade routes. They are gigantic floating warehouses. Some of them stretch longer than several football fields placed end to end. They move slowly across the water, sometimes looking almost motionless from the horizon. But inside those metal containers are electronics, clothes, machinery, food supplies, and thousands of other products traveling between continents. Many of these routes pass through narrow maritime gateways. One of the most important is the Strait of Malacca, a thin channel between Malaysia and Indonesia. It connects the Indian Ocean with the Pacific Ocean and serves as one of the busiest shipping lanes on the planet. Thousands of ships travel through that narrow passage every year. Another crucial gateway sits far to the west near the Persian Gulf. This is the Strait of Hormuz, a surprisingly narrow stretch of water through which a large percentage of the world's oil supply passes. If you zoom out on a global map, these narrow points look tiny. But in real life, they are incredibly important. Entire global supply chains depend on them remaining open and safe for shipping. Which means the Indian Ocean has quietly become one of the most strategically important regions in the modern world. Navies patrol its waters. International organizations monitor shipping traffic. Weather satellites constantly track storms forming over the ocean surface. Yet despite all this modern attention, the ocean still follows the same natural rhythms it always has. The monsoon winds still arrive on schedule. Warm currents move slowly across the basin. Seasonal rains sweep across coastal regions, exactly as they did centuries ago. And fishermen still head out before sunrise in small boats along thousands of kilometers of coastline. In places like Kerala on the southwestern coast of India, traditional fishing communities continue practices that are hundreds of years old. Wooden boats move gently across the morning water, while fishermen cast wide nets in the same areas their ancestors once used. Further west along the coast of Somalia and Kenya, similar scenes play out every day. Small coastal villages depend on the ocean for food and livelihood. Children grow up learning the moods of the sea the same way earlier generations did. The modern world may rely on satellites and radar systems, but many coastal communities still rely on observation, the color of the sky, the shape of the waves, the direction of the wind. Those signals tell experienced fishermen whether the ocean will be calm or restless that day. And in that quiet daily rhythm, you can see something fascinating. Despite thousands of years of technological progress, humans still interact with the ocean in ways that feel remarkably ancient. The tools may be different, the ships may be larger, but the relationship between people and the sea has not changed as much as we sometimes imagine. The Indian Ocean still feeds coastal populations. It still carries trade between continents. It still shapes weather patterns across half the planet. And perhaps most importantly, it still connects cultures. If you visit coastal cities around the Indian Ocean today, you can often see echoes of centuries-old trade networks in everyday life. Walk through a market in Zanzibar, and you might smell spices that originally traveled from South Asia. Visit ports in Dubai or Mumbai, and you will hear dozens of languages spoken by traders and sailors from around the world. The ocean has always been a meeting place. A quiet crossroads where distant cultures exchange goods, ideas, and sometimes entire traditions. Which brings us back to the simple question that started this journey. Why did the world choose the name Indian Ocean? The answer, after wandering through thousands of years of history, turns out to be surprisingly calm. Because for a very long time, India sat at the center of the trade networks that crossed these waters. Ancient geographers noticed that connection. Mapmakers repeated it. Explorers adopted it. And the name slowly became part of the global language of geography. No dramatic ceremony, no official declaration. Just centuries of habit. Sometimes history works like that. Quiet decisions made long ago slowly become permanent features of our world. And the Indian Ocean is one of those quiet historical decisions that stayed with us. Still stretching across the map, still carrying ships across its surface, still whispering the long story of trade, wind, and human curiosity to anyone patient enough to listen. And if you happen to be sitting somewhere near its shores tonight, listening to the slow rhythm of waves rolling toward the beach, you are hearing the same sound sailors heard thousands of years ago. A calm reminder that the ocean was here long before we named it, and it will remain long after we stop worrying about what to call it. And it will remain long after we stop worrying about what to call it. The Indian Ocean existed for millions of years before humans ever looked at a map and tried to label it. Long before traders sailed across it. Long before empires tried to control it. And definitely long before geographers decided it needed a neat little name printed in its laces. If we travel far back in time, not through history books but through geology, the story becomes even slower and calmer. Hundreds of millions of years ago, the continents looked completely different. There was once a giant supercontinent known as Gondwana. It included what we now call Africa, India, Antarctica, Australia, and parts of South America. Imagine all of those lands stuck together like pieces of an enormous puzzle. There was no Indian Ocean then, no Atlantic. No familiar world map hanging in a classroom. Just one massive landmass surrounded by ancient seas. But continents are not as stable as they appear. They move slowly across the surface of the Earth, drifting at speeds roughly similar to how fast fingernails grow. Which is not exactly dramatic. Geology rarely rushes. Over tens of millions of years, Gondwana began to break apart. Huge cracks opened between sections of land. Molten rock pushed upward from deep inside the planet. Slowly, water filled those widening gaps. One of those gaps eventually became the basin that would hold the Indian Ocean. The landmass that would become India actually drifted northward for millions of years before colliding with Asia. That collision created the towering mountains of the Himalayas. Meanwhile, the ocean basin to the south expanded and deepened. So the Indian Ocean, in a geological sense, is really the result of continents drifting apart and oceans filling the space between them. Not the most dramatic story perhaps, but very patient. Over time, currents formed, wind patterns developed. Marine ecosystems grew across coral reefs and deep-sea trenches. Long before humans sailed across these waters, the ocean was already full of life. Whales migrated through its depths. Sea turtles crossed enormous distances between feeding grounds. Coral reefs formed colorful underwater cities along tropical coastlines. If you could somehow stand on a shoreline 10 million years ago, the scene might feel strangely familiar. Waves rolling in, seabirds gliding across the sky, the ocean stretching endlessly toward the horizon. The difference is that no human footprints would appear in the sand. Eventually, of course, humans arrived. Early coastal communities learned to fish in shallow waters. They built small boats. They explored nearby islands. At first, these journeys stayed close to shore. The open ocean was unpredictable and intimidating, but curiosity is a powerful force. Over generations, people learned how winds behaved across different seasons. They watched stars move across the sky and used them for navigation. Slowly, cautiously, voyages became longer. And eventually humans began crossing enormous stretches of water that once seemed impossible. By the time ancient traders were sailing between India and East Africa, the Indian Ocean had already been shaping the planet for millions of years. Humans were simply the latest visitors, which is a slightly humbling thought. We like to imagine that our maps define the world. But in reality, the world existed perfectly well long before maps appeared. The ocean didn't suddenly become the Indian Ocean the moment someone wrote the name. It was already there, already moving, already connecting continents in ways humans were only beginning to understand. And even today, despite satellites and detailed charts, large parts of the ocean remain mysterious. The deep sea is one of the least explored environments on Earth, There are underwater mountains, enormous trenches, and strange ecosystems hidden far below the surface. Creatures live down there that humans have barely studied. Some glow softly in the dark. Others survive under crushing pressure and total darkness. The ocean still keeps many secrets, which feels oddly appropriate. After all, this is a body of water that quietly shaped global trade, cultural exchange, and exploration for thousands of years without ever asking for recognition. It simply existed. And humans gradually built their history around it. So when we look at a world map and see the label Indian Ocean printed across that vast blue space, we are really seeing a tiny piece of a much larger story. A story written in geology, climate, migration, and exploration. A story that began long before humans arrived and will continue long after our maps fade away. And in a strange way, that might be the most calming part of all. Because the ocean reminds us that history moves slowly. Empires rise and fall, cities grow and disappear. Maps change again and again. But the waves keep rolling toward the shore with the same quiet rhythm. Tonight, tomorrow, and for millions of years to come. And for millions of years to come. The Indian Ocean will continue doing what oceans have always done. Moving quietly, breathing with the rhythm of tides. Carrying currents that slide slowly beneath the surface like invisible rivers. If you were floating somewhere far out in the middle of the ocean right now, you might think nothing is happening. The water would look calm. The horizon would stretch endlessly in every direction. The sky above might slowly fade from blue to orange as the sun moves toward evening. But beneath that peaceful surface, the ocean is constantly moving. Huge underwater currents circulate warm and cold water across thousands of kilometers. Some of these currents move so slowly that they take years to complete their journey. Others respond quickly to winds blowing across the surface. The monsoon winds, for example, still dominate large parts of the Indian Ocean. Every year these seasonal winds shift direction, bringing heavy rains to South Asia and East Africa. Farmers depend on these rains. Crops grow or fail depending on when the monsoon arrives. So even today, millions of people living far away from the coastline still depend on the ocean's rhythms. The ocean shapes the weather, and the weather shapes human life. It is a chain of quiet influence that stretches across entire continents. Long before meteorological satellites existed, coastal communities already understood this connection. Fishermen, traders, and sailors carefully watched the sky for clues. They noticed patterns. Certain clouds appeared before the monsoon. Certain winds meant storms were approaching. Over generations, these observations became knowledge passed down through families. Even today, you can sometimes meet fishermen along the coast of Tamil Nadu or Sri Lanka who can predict changing weather simply by watching the horizon. Not with computers, just with experience. It's a quiet skill developed by living beside the ocean for many years. Meanwhile, far above the water, modern satellites orbit the planet, constantly scanning the Indian Ocean surface. They measure sea temperature. They track cyclones forming over warm water. They monitor currents that influence global climate. Because scientists now know that oceans play a huge role in regulating Earth's climate system. Warm water moving through the Indian Ocean affects weather patterns across Africa, Asia, and even parts of Europe. In other words, the ocean does not just connect countries. It connects climates. But despite all this scientific understanding, the ocean still manages to surprise us occasionally. Cyclones can form suddenly. Currents can shift. Strange marine creatures appear where no one expected them. The ocean remains a place where mystery still exists. And perhaps that is part of what makes it so calming. There is something strangely peaceful about a force of nature that continues operating on its own ancient schedule. Human civilization can be loud and chaotic. Cities grow quickly. Technology changes rapidly. News headlines appear and disappear every day. But the ocean moves at its own pace. A slower pace. The kind of pace that feels perfect for a quiet night of storytelling. Imagine a wooden sailing vessel drifting slowly across the Indian Ocean centuries ago. The sails are filled with warm monsoon wind. The crew sits quietly on deck under a sky full of stars. Somewhere far away lies the coast of India. In another direction, perhaps days away, lies the shoreline of East Africa. The sailors may not know exactly how large the ocean is. They may not know its geological history, but they know something simple and important. The ocean connects their world. And that connection has shaped human history more than most people realize. Because without oceans like this one, many cultures would have remained isolated for centuries. Ideas might have traveled slowly. Trade networks might never have expanded so widely. Religions, languages, and technologies might have spread much more slowly. But the Indian Ocean quietly solved that problem. It became a bridge, a wide moving bridge made of water. And humans learned how to cross it. Which brings us gently toward the final thought of our journey tonight. A simple question that started everything. Why is it called the Indian Ocean? After wandering through geology, ancient trade routes, monsoon winds, and modern shipping lanes, the answer turns out to be surprisingly simple. Because for centuries the region around India stood at the center of this vast maritime network. Ancient geographers noticed that. Mapmakers repeated it. Explorers wrote it into their journals. And over time the name became permanent. Sometimes history is not shaped by dramatic decisions. Sometimes it is shaped by quiet habits repeated for generations. And the name Indian Ocean is one of those habits that stayed. And the name stayed. Printed across maps, taught in classrooms, spoken casually by millions of people who may never even see the ocean in person. The Indian Ocean today is the third largest ocean on Earth. It stretches between Africa, Asia, and Australia, touching the shores of dozens of nations. Yet despite its size, it often feels quieter in global conversations than the Pacific Ocean or the Atlantic Ocean. Maybe because its history is less about dramatic exploration and more about slow connection. For thousands of years, merchants crossed these waters without trying to conquer them. They simply followed the winds, they visited ports, they traded goods, and they sailed home again. It was less like a battlefield and more like a marketplace. A very large, very watery marketplace. Imagine standing in an ancient port city along the Indian Ocean, sometime around the year 1200. Ships are anchored near the harbor. Sailors speak languages from Arabia, Persia, India, and Africa. The air smells of spices, dried fish, and wooden ship decks warmed by the sun. Merchants argue gently over prices while scribes record transactions. Somewhere nearby, a storyteller is probably describing distant lands beyond the horizon. All of that activity depends on one quiet fact. The ocean connects them. Without the water between those lands, none of those encounters would happen. So the ocean became part of everyday life for countless coastal communities. Fishermen woke early each morning. Shipbuilders shaped wooden hulls along the shoreline. Children watched sails appear and disappear on the horizon. Life moved in rhythm with the tides. And through all of those centuries, the ocean never asked to be named. It never demanded recognition. The waves simply continued rolling toward shore. Yet humans, as usual, like to organize the world with labels. So eventually, cartographers printed those two words across the blue expanse of their maps. Indian Ocean, a simple geographical label. But behind that label lies a story stretching across geology, climate, trade, exploration, and culture. A story that began long before humans built their first ships. And a story that continues quietly today. Cargo vessels still cross those same waters. Fishing boats still leave coastal villages before sunrise. Monsoon winds still guide sailors just as they did thousands of years ago. The ocean has changed very little, which might be the most comforting thought of all. Because while human history moves quickly and sometimes chaotically, the natural world often moves slowly and patiently. The ocean reminds us of that patience. It reminds us that some things exist on timescales far beyond human lifetimes. And maybe that is why listening to stories about oceans can feel strangely relaxing. The waves move slowly, the horizon stays steady, and history flows gently from one shore to another. So tonight, as our quiet historical journey comes to an end, imagine the surface of the Indian Ocean under a calm night sky. The stars reflecting softly on the water, a distant ship moving slowly across the horizon, and somewhere along the coast, the steady sound of waves meeting the shore. The same sound sailors heard thousands of years ago. The same sound people will hear thousands of years from now. Because names may change. Empires may rise and fall. Maps may be redrawn again and again. But the ocean will remain quiet, endless, and still patiently carrying the long story of our world across its waters.